Hello guys, welcome to a new video. In today's video, we're gonna review Canon 450D DSLR camera. So this is how this camera looks like. Before we start the video, I request you, if you are new to my channel, please subscribe to the channel and don't forget to press the notification icon. So this camera was launched in 2008. So it's almost 14-year-old camera. So can this camera still get great photos in 2022 or not? We will soon find out. This camera have a 12 megapixel crop sensor APS-C camera. So this is a APS-C camera, so that means it have a crop factor of 1.6 times, as is the case with all the Canon cameras. All the Canon APS-C camera have a crop factor of 1.6. So this camera sensor is almost 1.6 times smaller than a full frame sensor, which is a 35mm sensor. Although it's a 12 megapixel sensor, but 12 megapixel is still more than good enough. You can do professional work even with 12 megapixel. You can make really large prints and you can do professional work even with a 12 megapixel sensor. Because if you upload your photos on a social media, most of the photos are just 2 megapixels, because the social media, for example Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, they all compress your photos. So even if you upload a 100 megapixel photo, it would be compressed to hardly 1 or 2 megapixels. And 12 megapixel can make a really large print. Unless you do a lot of cropping, 12 megapixel is more than good enough for you. But it's not the megapixel that determines the quality of the photo. It's the lens, it's the sensor, and how the image is being processed inside the camera that determines the actual image quality. If I talk about the autofocus points on this camera, it has 9 autofocus points, and the autofocus is pretty good in photography. In good lighting situation, the autofocus works pretty fine. In low lighting situation, it can struggle a bit. If we talk about the frame per second on this camera, it has 4 frames per second, which is not very high. So don't consider using this camera for sports or wildlife photography, because for that you need a camera with higher frame per second rate, maybe 10 or more. So this camera is okay if you do portrait photography, if you do landscape photography, if you shoot within a studio, then this camera can do a decent job. Now let's talk about the ISO performance of this camera. So the ISO range on this camera goes from 100 to 1600, which is very small range. I would say this is not a great camera if you are shooting in low lighting situation. When the sun is setting and you still have decent amount of light, or if you are shooting in day lighting situation, then this camera can perform really very well. Or if you are shooting in studio where you have ample amount of light, then this camera can still take great images, I would say. But if you don't have access to good lighting situation, then this camera will perform very miserably. It will struggle a lot to give you faster shutter speed, and it can result in a lot of blurred photos due to the camera shake. But if you want to avoid those kind of situation, maybe you can use a tripod, or you can use 50mm f1.8 primelens. That would let you shoot at a faster shutter speed, because that would give you more light compared to the 1855mm kit lens that you will get. With a 50mm lens, you can also get nice background blur, and you can shoot really nice portrait photos as well. So if you combine that lens, and then even in bad lighting situation, you can still get nice photos. If I talk about the weight of this camera, it's around 524 grams, and it is not a very heavy camera, and it is not very light either. And if you hold it in your hand, it feels really good. It is really easy to change settings, as is the case with all the Canon cameras. On the back side, it has a 3-inch screen, and the resolution is not that great. It's a 230 kilo dot screen, and if you had a higher resolution screen, then your photos would look much sharper and you would be able to see more details on this screen. But because of the lower resolution, when you zoom your photos, you are not able to see all those details. So if you want to see if you have missed the focus or nailed the focus, you want to see all the details, then you will have to download those photos onto your laptop or computer and then see it on a bigger screen. Now let me talk about the dynamic range of this camera. So the dynamic range is pretty bad. It is just 10.8, which is very less. So this camera struggles a lot if there is a lot of variation in the lighting situation. You have a lot of brighter areas and you have also a lot of darker areas. It is not able to handle those kind of situations so well. And if you compare this with your latest smartphones, they are pretty good when it comes to the dynamic range. Some of the photos that I took with this cameras in such kind of lighting situation, I would say I could get much better photos with a mobile phone compared to this camera. But this camera also have exposure bracketing. So if you make use of exposure bracketing, you can take different exposure shots. For example, you can take one photo overexposed, one photo at the correct exposure, one photo underexposed, and then later on combine them in Lightroom to create a high dynamic range photo. One thing that I forgot to mention is that this camera cannot do video. This camera can make only and only photos. So if you need a camera that can also do video, then this is not the camera for you. This can do only and only photos. Now let me show you how this camera looks from close-up. So from the back, this camera looks like this, and this is a pretty decent screen. As I told you, it's not very high resolution, and this is a fixed screen. It is not a touch screen either, and it cannot flip out either. So whatever options or menus or settings that you have to change are using these buttons. From the top, it looks like this. As is the case with all the Canon camera, you see a familiar dial over here, and you have the on off switch over here, and you have this dial over here using which you can adjust your shutter speed, aperture and other settings. And if you see this side, so it is over here that if you want to connect your camera to your computer. And then on the other side you have the slot for the SD card. And on the back side here you have the battery compartment, and the battery life is pretty good on this camera. If you charge the battery fully, then it will definitely last you for more than 400 photos. And from the front, this camera looks like this. If I hold it in my hand, it feels really great, and it is really easy to change all the options and settings. Now I'm gonna put onto the screen some of the sample photos that are taken with this camera, and all the photos that I took were using this 40mm f2.8 STM lens. This lens is a great lens. It takes really sharp photos, and since the aperture is f2.8, so it lets you in slightly more light compared to your kit lens, and you also get more background blur using this lens, and the results are really nice compared to the kit lens. As I already told you, this camera struggles a lot when there is a lot of variation in the lighting situation. You have a lot of bright areas and dark areas. So I would say in those kind of situation, I could get better photos with my mobile phone, my iPhone, compared to this camera. But I'm gonna put all the photos on the screen and you can see the photos in which there was not much variation in the lighting situation. This camera performed excellent. I would say this is a great camera if you want to shoot indoors, or if you want to shoot outdoor when there is not much variation in the lighting situation. I would give this camera 6 out of 10 when it comes to photography. I'm gonna deduct all these marks because of the low lighting performance of this camera. It doesn't perform so good in low lighting situation, and the dynamic range is also really very poor on this camera. So those two are my major drawbacks. So the photos don't look that great. If you compare the photos with the mobile phone photos, I would say your latest smartphone can take better photos than this camera. But if you still need a camera, you need a DSLR if you are really very tight on budget, because with a DSLR, of course, you can use different lenses. On a mobile phone, you cannot use any other lenses. But with this camera, even though this is 14-year-old, you can still use all the lenses. You can use a 50mm lens, you can use a telephoto lens, you can use a lens especially for wildlife photography, or you can use a very high telephoto lens if you want to do astrophotography. So this camera still gives you the flexibility to use different lenses in different lighting situation. For example, you can even use a macro lens. So that is one advantage with this camera compared to a smartphone. But as I already told you, I would say Canon 550D camera would be a better choice, because on that camera you can shoot in full HD video, you can connect an external microphone, and that camera have a really good low lighting performance as well, and the images out of the camera looks really very nice. So I would recommend Canon 550D over this camera. And if you talk about the price for this camera, I got this camera used only the body of the camera for around $50 US, which is a really good price. So I would say you can still get this camera body for 50 to 60 USD, which is a really very cheap price, because in this price I don't think you're gonna get any other DSLR in this price bracket. So if you are really very tight on budget, then maybe you can invest in this camera for around 50 to 60 US. You can get the camera body. You can then for another 40 to 50 US get the 50mm f1.8 older lens. So within 100 US you have this camera body along with the 50mm lens, and then you can take decent photos in low lighting situation. You can get really nice portrait photos as well, and you can learn the basics of photography. You can master the exposure triangle, and once you have learned the photography, then later on you can upgrade to a more expensive and newer camera. But if you need something that can take really nicer photos, because this camera I would say struggles a lot in most of the lighting situation, then I would say then you should go for a slightly better camera. Canon 1100D, Canon 1200D, 1300D, Canon 550D or Canon 600D would be much better choice compared to this camera. All those camera can do video as well and can take really nice photos as well. But I would say now it's up to you. I have given my honest opinion and genuine review about this camera. So it's your choice if you want to get this camera still or not. Alright guys, I hope you like the video. If you like the video, please share it so that it reaches more people. And if you haven't still subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel and don't forget to press the notification icon.